to Corporate Cafecito, a podcast based on professional development, career growth, and respecting our cultural identity. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Corporate Cafecito. Yo soy Nayeli Suarez Gas, and today with me is Maria Burns Ortiz. And for those of you who don't know her, you might know her. You may have played her games. She is a big advocate for making sure that we see ourselves when we are educating our children and bringing them along. So, Maria, before I say too much, why don't you introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners?
Yeah. So I am a co-founder and CEO of 7 Generation Games, where we focus on making educational games that are culturally reflective and that teach, right? So there's two parts to what we do. We really want to make sure that kids have the best possible foundational learning opportunities and working on that. And then we also really want to make sure that kids can see themselves reflected in the curriculum that they're taught and the games that they play. And at 7 Generation Games, we've worked to come up with a way to do both, which is merging learning and fun and representation.
Yeah, I love it. And you are from Venezuela, right?
My family is my mom's family.
Okay.
So yeah, I grew up in Los Angeles, between Los Angeles and rural North Dakota, which is a very interesting place to be, especially if you are Latino 30 plus years ago. It shifted a little bit, I think. And now I live in Minneapolis. But yeah, my family's Venezuelan. Not very many folks.
So many of us went to what I used to call it the Mexican summer camp, because we used to get out of school and then our parents would ship us there. But you were actually sent to North Dakota, right?
Yeah. It's funny because we were the exact opposite. We were in North Dakota for some years. And when we moved back, we were in Los Angeles and some people were talking. And my mom was looking at them and her friend said, "Why do you keep looking at those people?" She said, "Well, they were speaking Spanish. So I thought maybe I knew them." Because if we had been in North Dakota, she probably would have known anyone else in the state at the time speaking Spanish. So yeah, it was a very different kind of.
It's very different. And, I think that when you think about what you're trying to do with your company or what you are doing with your company, it's that beautiful seeing ourselves in others, right? So we yearn for community. I remember when I was studying abroad, every time I heard someone speak Spanish, I would turn around and be like, "You're home." It's part of our cultural identity. It's how we look, how we sound, what we eat. So how do you showcase that in your games? Maybe talk about why you made them, because I love that story.
Well, it's really interesting that you said that because when I was young, we moved from Los Angeles to rural North Dakota, right, to a town called Minot, North Dakota. And it's funny, my mom talks now, she'll be like, I used to, and when you go from a community where it's very diverse and people reflect you and people are speaking Spanish all the time, you don't really realize how that's not necessarily the case lots of other places,
right.
And my mom laughs because she says, at one point when I said, "Why did you name me Maria? No one else has that name." And she's like, in Latin America, everyone else has that name, to the point where people always go, but what name do you use? And I'm like, no,
we have Maddie's and
exactly. But, for me, I think that's really important because also being there, I realized, just the lack of reflection that there often is in the curriculum. And it's something that's always stuck with me. And when we were building out our games, we actually started focused on Indigenous communities, working within Indigenous tribal areas and reservations in those schools. And what we really wanted to do was make sure that kids saw themselves reflected, because really you learn more effectively when the content reflects you, right? And I know everybody goes through school, and one of the big things people say is, "Well, am I ever going to use this?" And if no one is ever reflected like you using it, you think probably you won't. And if you see yourself, you hear yourself, you see stories like yours, communities like yours reflected in that content, that curriculum, you pay more attention. I mean, and I think that's one of the big problems. And the vast majority of, I would say, the U.S. K-12 curriculum certainly is not centered around diversity, right? And I mean, in a lot of ways, we're teaching things very similarly to the way we did them a century ago, where schools were
Oh,
not
yeah.
only not integrated, but there were no minority students, historically underrepresented students, didn't even have the opportunities to go to schools in a lot of cases, and so
Yes.
that makes it really hard to see where you fit in and see where you belong and to see it applicable to you. And so we wanted to shift that and make it so it's used in your community. It's used by people who look like you, who sound like your grandma, whatever that is. When you hear that and see that, you feel reflected and you're more engaged. And so that was really, really, really important to us. And the fun thing is we built it out with one tribe, and then we had it very, specific to them in their community. And then we were going to, in the tribe next to them down the road,
Like we
about an
want
hour and a half,
something. Yeah.
they said, when are you making our game? And so it's kind of started from there, and we started
Yeah.
working with other communities, and then we moved into English language learners, but I say rural English language learners, which I think are also often forgotten in the conversation often around English language learners. And we were working and one of the teachers that actually came and she said, look, I have, and I can attest this actually happens, because people say, no. She says, I have 2 semesters of high school Spanish taught by someone who took 2 semesters of high school Spanish, right? And I know that I'm not serving the, English language learners that come into my classroom. And so we looked at how could we take the games that we'd built and use those now, not just teaching culture, but also and math and all those things, but also integrating a language component, so that the kids could be included in the classroom, right? So there's not, your English is there, go do this project over here by yourself. And then also teachers were able, even if they didn't have that language ability, to see where the students were. Were they struggling because they didn't understand the math concepts, or were they struggling because it was a language barrier? And those are 2 very different challenges that we really wanted to work to bridge, because I talk a lot about my experience is just, transformative, because not because of something I did, but my mom was raised by her grandmother who, could not, she used to call it calculus, right? She said she couldn't pronounce it, but she said she was adamant that my mom be getting an A in it. She says, why do you have a B? And she said, well, it's really hard math. And she said, they don't give A's in it, right? And so to have somebody who was pushed that way educationally, but I know a lot of other folks, from our communities don't necessarily have that foundation, don't necessarily have that strength. And we really wanted to look at how can we build that, because it is tough. And like I said, my great grandmother had an 8th grade education, right? And so she pushed it, but the truth is she couldn't have helped, right? She couldn't have said, here's how you do this. Right. And there are so many households and families, and not just within the Latino community, across the country, in every community, right? That no matter how much you want to help your child, if you didn't master dividing fractions, right? You can't.
Yeah, you can't.
And so that's something we're really trying to shift and give those tools to help bring up students who maybe don't have all of the opportunities, but certainly deserve them.
When you're talking, I'm like going through all these things. One of the things I talk a lot about in my career coaching is I always tell people to listen to the message, not the tone, and to try to personalize it. I remember growing up with the math problems. I didn't know some of the words. And so I would be like, okay, we have 2 of these and 7 of these, or, the train and blah, blah, blah. And I just remember my parents would always teach me back it out and change the names. I do think it's really awesome. Like my kids will have math worksheets, and now I see names like Rafael and Pedro and Maria, and I'm just like, wonderful, it was so hard. I remember I was whenever Hurricane Katrina happened, and we had all grown up, like my dad loved 70s music and he loved American Pie. And that was the first time we knew what a levee was. And I remember I was talking to a group of friends and we're like, oh, that's a levee, drove my Chevy,
Right.
Yeah, it's like, because we didn't know the words, like we could pronounce them, we could say them, but even then we didn't know what they meant.
Yeah.
And when you're learning, I think that's a big gap. And, to your point, my parents would always be like, go to your Tia Nena's house because she had finished high school and was in college. And so anytime I needed math homework, they'd be like, there's only one house you can go to, like go to that house and she's going to help you. I will say this though, now that my kids are in 6th and 7th grade,
Mhm.
their math is really hard. But, I think that, one, I would say like try to extrapolate, get what you can get the meaning out of the word problems and try to listen
Right.
to what the question is being asked. But then also, learn those words. And I feel like my whole life, I've always had to like write words in the side of the paper so that I could look them up later. And so no one ever looked like me or sounded like me. This would have been like early 80s
Mhm.
when I was in grade school. And so I think that this is really great. And, we talk about like you had mentioned when we were having cafecito that no one should be the embodiment. So even within your games, you make sure that it's not, all Mexicans,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that was one of the things. And like I said, it's, it's interesting because our team is very diverse and we have lots of different accents, right? And one of the things that, and I think it happens a lot is people just assume that an accent is one way, right? And we did a project in Chile and the person said to us, that's a Chilean accent. And you're like, yes, it is. But it was so interesting to those kids because so often so much of the content that they were getting was either a Mexican accent or a Spanish accent, right? And because it's, where is the bulk of the content produced and created? And so that was really important to
Right.
us that there is a shift, and so, and sometimes it doesn't matter, but, if you're doing a game about Chilean history, it does matter. And also because we were able to do games very specific to communities, we built out a game about the founding of Chile. And then also, for Spanish, we have a game called Aztec series. And so it's Aztec, like AZ and then TECH because we were being fun. But,
Oh,
that
nice.
game is also, then the accents there are Mexican because that's, the region that the story is being
Right.
told in. And so that was really important for us. But then, if they're based in the US, we've got a mix because sometimes it largely just happens to be who happened to be standing by in the office that I was like, come here, we need somebody to record in whatever. But I think that's a big fun part of us. And the truth is the accents in the United States are a mix of accents. And I think it's really important. And similarly, when we focused on
Right.
rural areas, that was a really important depiction too, because so often when you're depicted with, Latino community, and it's and you don't necessarily see kids. A lot of times you talk about the impact
Right.
of rural Latinos, and you'll see like, farm workers and things, which is important, and that's part of it, right? But what about the kids that just happen to be living in the town that's where their parents are, and really be mindful of that. And so we found, whether it's Santiago, Chile, or it's, somewhere randomly in Iowa, we really wanted to make sure that we were authentic to what that experience is and looks like, because like I said, I think so often too, and it's not just for us, it's not just for the depiction for kids who see themselves reflected, although that is a big part of what we do, but also for kids who aren't from those communities to see that diversity, to see that there's a difference, and some people, speak Spanish at home and some people don't speak Spanish at home, and that there's different accents. And I would
Yes.
argue most people I know speak a level of Spanglish, whatever
Oh,
that is,
yeah.
living here. And so I think that's been a big thing for us too. And it's interesting. We were testing at a school not that long ago, and we were watching, and we knew that some the kids were a range. One of the kids kept flipping back and forth because you can do the language part, and someone said, I know that kid speaks perfect English, but it was just that shift to hear someone that sounds like the discussions that they have at home, to be able to hear it in your first language, that was so important and I think impactful. And it wasn't even that they needed to hear it that way, but it meant something. And
It
that's what the
does.
cool part of what we get to do is.
I love that. Before my kids started 3rd grade, the 3rd grade teacher, her name's Senora Jacobo, and I talk about her all the time because I think she's amazing. She wrote them all a postcard. And, it was for my son Mario. She's like, Hola, Mario, I can't wait to see you cuando empecemos en septiembre. I hope you had a great summer, y que hayas comido mucha nieve, and I can't wait to play. And then, she wrote, "Isn't it awesome siendo bilingüe?" And I love that she wrote that because,
Yeah.
I was just like, "Oh, that's so cool." And he just read it.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think it's really important, like, one, to have materials in school or have
Mhm.
someone in school that can nurture that. And you're right, to see our culture represented in a school setting, especially when you think about like cultural norms.
Mm.
And that's what I think it's beautiful about this country is that we celebrate like so many people's things. And
Right.
like, you think everything from like Chinese New Year to, I can't even think of all the holidays we celebrate, but they're
Mhm.
so exciting because we get to partake in that culture,
Yeah.
and see that culture and enjoy it. And I think it's really important for our kids to also be proud because we have like, my parents were, born and raised in Mexico. And then I'm first generation here. So, they're like Mexican, I'm Mexican
Mm.
American, but now my
Mm.
children are American Mexican, right? Their
Right.
English is their dominant language, no matter how hard I
Right.
try to get them to speak Spanish to me. But it's like, how do I also, bring them back in to connect with their
Right.
culture? So I think it's a duality of what you're doing. One, it's for us to see ourselves, but I also think it brings a lot of pride for that like second or third generation to also see their families in the books or the
Right.
games.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's funny. My kids are the same way. I'll be like, today solo español. And then 5 minutes later, I'm like, how did we switch back into English?
Yeah,
Like, I
yeah,
don't
yeah. Like,
understand how this
no.
happens.
Yeah.
But, it's interesting because I was having this conversation with my
Mhm.
husband, whose family is Mexican, and he was talking about how interesting it is to see, and his dad grew up in Los Angeles at a time where they said, do not speak Spanish to your children,
Yeah.
and so he said, to go from where my grandparents, his grandparents were told not to speak your
Mhm.
language in public to our children now go to an immersion school, a dual immersion school,
Mhm.
and to say, where my kids now, it's celebrated that they're able to speak their language in public. He talks about just how that shift has happened and how interesting it is to see that and that welcoming of being bilingual. And hopefully in most communities, some places
Yes.
I will admit it is not still, but should be. And that shift. And I think that's what has me really the most excited is to see that we are being able to bring those stories out. And also one of the things early on people say is like, well, are these games just for ELL students? Are they just for Indigenous youth? Are they just for, and the answer is no, they're
No,
not.
they're for
Just the way that,
everybody. Yep.
yeah, exactly. Just the way that learning about George Washington isn't just
Mhm.
for, young, white students who are in the classroom, learning about diverse histories isn't just for kids from those communities. And I'm really excited and I'm happy to see that in many places,
Mhm.
there's a shift toward that. And it does concern me sometimes too, some of the places where they're pushing back against that, because I think,
Yes.
history is part of what happened. The diverse cultures in this country are part of this country, and celebrating that, like you were talking about, isn't excluding anyone. It's creating this atmosphere where we're able to learn more and share more and understand more about everyone. And I only see that as being a good thing.
I 100% agree. And I love it for many reasons. So my youngest son, one time, I think he must have been like 6 or 7. And I said, you know what? Te voy a poner salsa en tu taco. I'm like, you have to learn how to eat chile. And he goes, why? And I go, because you're Mexican. And he goes, I'm Mexican? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, I didn't know that. And I'm like, we go to Mexico for every vacation to see our family. Like I'm like, all of our food that we eat is Mexican. And you know what? It hit me like he just thinks this is how people eat and
Right.
what people do. And it's just because it's so normal for his like his culture is so normal because it's how we live it. And my parents live by us and they watch them. And there's, I'm like, go get, give this to your abuelita. That he did. Then I had to start sharing other cultures with him so that he could appreciate like the life that he had was our culture.
Right.
And so I thought that was really, really funny when he was like, we're Mexican. I'm like, yes.
Exactly.
um,
Yeah.
but so when we talk about diversity, one of the things that, seventh generation has done amazing is you have this wonderful, diverse team too, right?
Right. Yeah. And that's something that I'd say we're really proud of, because, and I would love to say we made a really big effort to make that happen, but it's just kind of been the natural order of things in some ways. And I think, I think there's a couple of reasons why that happens. So we have my co-founder is my mom. So obviously we have two Latina founders, and then one of the big things that we have worked towards is making sure that our team reflects the communities that we serve, because I think that's really important. I don't think you can effectively tell stories about communities that you're not a part of. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't at all be involved in that, but to say, here's what a story is like from this perspective, you have to have people from that community involved in creating those stories. Otherwise, it's just, here's some stuff that I Googled and found out. And that's not where that authentic representation comes from. And so that's been really important to us. But also, it's not just on our creative side that we have that. I mean, our developers, our team, varies between 70, because we're a small team, but between 70 to 80%, Black, Indigenous, and Latino. And that has just been the case over the years. And it's interesting because someone said to me, well, to some extent, it's probably a little bit of the network effect. And we talk about that because, you think so often, where do people, and this is why tech, I think largely is, white and Asian, largely dudes, because people's, in the industries, people say, who do you recommend for jobs, right? And it's hard to hire new positions. And you look around your network and you think, who do I know that's good? And people's networks largely reflect them. And it's not an intentional thing, but it just whether it's your families, your friends, your school, and 100%. So when we started doing that, and someone had pointed that out to me a few years ago, it's probably just your network, but we have more diverse networks, therefore we get more diverse applicants and we get more diverse people. And so I think that's been a big part of what we do, but also it's really, really important to me. And we say whenever anyone starts on our team, that we want them to know that we hired them for them. And they are not carrying in with them all of the hopes and dreams of their community or their family or any of those things when they walk in the door, that they don't have to prove themselves because of that, because that has happened. It happens to me. It still happens to me sometimes, although I feel like I'm better at like not taking that on. But, to be so many times I've been the only Latina in a room. Right. Yes. And it is hard not to feel like there's this pressure that if you mess up, it's not just, oh, it didn't work out.
Like I'm letting down a community if I mess up, or, like we talk about the first and onlys and how we have to like represent and be loud and do all these things and really pave the ways. And I think it's both, right? Like if you just come in and you're just you and you do amazing work and inspire, these educational games, like you will make us proud. Right. But not to come in with that like weight on your shoulders because we, owe someone or want to make a community.
Yeah. And, I always say to people, no one ever says, and it is hard if you look around. And I think also people walk into our office and they look around and they realize that they are not the sole, representative of whether it's being Black or Latino or Indigenous or, anything. And they don't have to feel like they have to prove that. And I think that's really a challenge. And I think we as a society don't do enough to combat that, because one of the things I say to people too is, look, maybe it won't work out. Maybe it will be a failure. You just never know, right? And I hire people because I really, truly believe they will. But so no one has ever looked around an organization and said, you know what? We hired a white guy before and it didn't work out, so we don't do that anymore, And so I said, so look, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. It's not a reflection on anything. And I think once you take away that stress, because often we get a lot of entry-level younger folks, might be their first or their second job. And for them, it does take some of that weight off. Just go and do the best that you possibly can do. And don't worry about how it's going to reflect on everyone else, because, we hired you because we think you're really great and we believe in you. And I think taking that and being empowered to be yourself, not that representative of everything else, really does make it easier for folks to then just go and do a great job. And I think that's something we try and build. And I think it's something that, needs to be better done in a lot of other places. Because like I said, I personally myself have seen that happen, and really being
Yes.
mindful of that. And that's a cool thing when you start a company, you get to do all the things that other people did that you didn't like. You can do them differently.
I'm gonna kind of put you on the spot, not intentionally, because you may not intentionally be doing it, but you do make us really proud. And I believe you were part of 7 Generation Games, was part of the United States of Women, right?
Oh,
You got to go to Washington,
yeah.
D.C. Tell me about that experience, because there you were
Yeah.
all of our voices, even if you didn't want to be Maria.
It was interesting. So that was one of those things. So it was, it was the White House did a State of Women, and honestly, it was one of the things where they said, "Could you come?" And I said, "Sure, sounds great, let's do it."
Yeah, like I should be there.
And then it was really unique because I didn't realize at the time how big it was going to be. It said the White House, and so it was, under the Obama White House, the brightest, he was outgoing, but they said, it's the White House. So I said, yeah, I mean, obviously they invite me, I'm going to go. And so it was at the convention center, but it was really incredible because it was thousands of women. And the session that I was speaking at was about entrepreneurship and building that out and really being that voice and being, advocating for yourself and looking at how do you build out companies and how do you make sure that when you walk in and you're the only woman in the room or the only Latina in the room, that you feel comfortable, using that voice, and also just finding that place. And I think one of the things that I remember, one of the questions that someone, was, what advice would you give? And I think my big thing, and I think it's especially true for Latinas, and maybe because I stole it from my mom, who stole it from her grandmother, was about, there's not a right time. And so you really need to just do it, right? Because you always think, after I'm more settled in my career, after my kids are older, after all of this, and then
when
suddenly
we have a little more money, when we have more time. Yeah.
And I know my mom said her grandmother had said it to her, and she said to me, look, there's never a right time. And so you just go and do it. And I think that was a really important thing. And I've kind of tried to use that as a gauge, especially within my professional life, about, is this, because there's not. And I think that's a really important part of what we need to do. And I think I honestly think Latinas are a little bit more conservative in that regard, because we are used to being like responsible for so much and so many people
and so many people, yes,
that it's like, well, is this, and we're not necessarily great at putting ourselves first or saying, by me doing this thing, it will actually help serve everyone else. And I think when I look at that, there is no perfect time, but will this be the right move? And that's a very different answer than like, ooh, should I do this?
No, 1000%. And you're right about like, sometimes we're just waiting for that perfect moment, and that moment doesn't exist, right? It'll be the right moment when you do it, when you start it, whenever you start it. And, I didn't plan either of my pregnancies, and I wouldn't have done it any other way. I'm just like, oh, we're pregnant. Oh, we're pregnant again. And so, if I had planned it, I probably would have been more strategic, but there never would have been a perfect time. And even when I went to school, or, it took me 5.5 years, I couldn't have finished in 4. I was working full time. So, but it's like, we may be living these like goals of like, oh, I should have been finished in 4. I should have kids by 30 or et cetera. And it's like, those are so many external pressures that we take on, or maybe they're pressures from our family or our community, or just like expectations that we've adopted as our own. To your point, like, that's great advice. If you want to start a business, if you want to become an entrepreneur, whenever you start, that's the right time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, I think the other thing too is like, you just bring we started 7 Generation Games, and I had, we really went all in on everything. And I had just had, my son was maybe 4 months old when we got into this program. He just went everywhere, right? Like, just bring the baby with you and you figure it out. And like I said, my mom was my co-founder, so we did some juggling on things like that. But I think, one of the things too is, it's been helpful for me to really just say, your life doesn't end because you have your kids. To be honest, I think I became a much better boss and manager and just employee in general, because before I had kids, I was like, what? Oh, it's the end of the world now. I can't focus
Right.
on that because I have to grab the child that's jumping off of the dining room table and stop the other one from putting something into the electrical socket or what have you. And so it really focused me in a way that I think if I'd put them off thinking, when I have, after when I get to
Yes.
that perfect dream point that doesn't exist, like you said about having children, it would have been different. I wouldn't have been as
Oh,
good
a
an employee. I wouldn't
1000%.
have been as
Yeah.
good a manager because, you have different things and suddenly your priorities shift. And, if I don't get this contract, it's not the end of the world.
Right.
Whereas if you, can sit there and dwell on it as opposed to, run after
Mhm.
people, sometimes it feels different. And I think it really helped. Now, I'm not saying if you need some levity, go and have children right away, but I do think it made that
No,
difference.
that does not help. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, Maria, thank you so much for coming on. We are so proud of you. Like, this is
Oh.
amazing. I love seeing it. If you haven't checked out Seven Generation Games, please do so. See the work, that our community is doing, that Maria is doing. See yourself represented in these games. Share them with your children. And, we look forward to having you on here again. I know you have so many stories and just keep trucking.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.